I guess we can start. All right. Any questions about anything? You know, I don't do St. Patrick's Day really. It's just not exciting to me or something. What about you? It was good? Good? Yeah? Yes? Format of the exam. Yeah, it's going to be significant amount of like short answer stuff, but you know, maybe one or two calculation type thing. Like nothing lengthy, no lengthy calculations. By the way, the question for those of you watching at home, because I know this is probably important to you, since you constitute about at least 3/7 of the class, the format of the exam. Okay, a lot of it is going to be short answer and a little bit of calculation and nothing lengthy, and there's no biology, okay, as I told you the first week when everyone asked me in a panic whether there's going to be biology on the exam. No, there's none of that. And what else? There is going to be some stuff on standard genetic algorithms based on the knowledge you've developed over reading the book and the homework, the first homework. And also what we're going to talk about today and Thursday, we're going to cement some of that stuff a little bit more. But it's mostly going to be on Markov chain-y kind of things, because that's really been the heart of what we talked about so far. So just an example of something, I might draw a picture of a Markov chain and say, which of the following is the probability transition matrix for this Markov chain? Or true or false, does this converge to this as n goes to infinity, that kind of thing. Things that you can figure out fairly easily from the picture. So does that answer your question pretty much? Okay. Trevor? Does it have a set weight in the grading scheme? Yeah, I'm thinking the following. Somewhere between, it's going to be something like final exam 48, midterm 37, homework 15, something along those lines, plus or minus 2 or 3 points. I don't want to make the final exam count more than half because that sends people into a panic, in my experience. Okay, Rishi.
48 isn't a prime number. What are you doing?
Well, I can't do both 47. See, I tried having all 3 prime, but I couldn't figure out a way to do it and make the homework not count too much. So anyway. Class participation? Well, you know, you're really good about voting in the polls, you know, so that's, and also bringing up, talking about fun stuff, whatever. Yeah. Yeah, so class participation at least, no. I know there are people who have direct conflicts with this class, who are taking this class and watching it solely on video note, which is okay with me. Not that there's anything wrong with that, okay? Other questions? And there are people with injuries. There's at least 2 people with broken wrists and arms, one of whom is a righty who has a left arm broken, the other one is a righty who has a right arm broken. What's that? Is Shane here? I don't think so. Yeah, okay. Yeah, actually, he emailed me last night and said he's having a hard time writing, so he hasn't been coming to class, and so he's watching the videos, all that stuff. Anyway. Okay. All right, well, just want to wrap up this discussion of simulated annealing, and then I'm going to move on to talk about genetic algorithms for several days. So you have your simulated annealing. And the problem setup is that S is some big finite set, okay? And you have some function E defined on S. And your goal is to minimize E. So you want to find some X in S that minimizes E. And the way simulated annealing works is as follows. So SA goes like this. You choose this annealing schedule. So it's a sequence of temperatures T1, T2, T3, dot, 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 positive and decreasing to 0 monotonically. I throw around that word a lot, monotonically. I want to make sure everybody knows what that means. Monotonically. Everybody know what that means? Yes? Okay, good. I just want to make sure. And then you run the Metropolis algorithm. You initialize at some, say, x in S, chosen however at random or from everybody's experience. And then you run the Metropolis, starting from x at temperature T1, say. That's the first thing you do. And you let that settle out. And I want to give you a little piece of slang here. This is Monte Carlo slang. You let it burn in. Okay, that's what when people do Monte Carlo, they talk about the burn-in period for Monte Carlo algorithms, how long it takes for things to sort of sift out and stabilize. Okay, so you let it burn in, and then you initialize the next Metropolis one by finding the highest, or E you want to minimize, right? The lowest E thing, the lowest E point that you've come up with so far. And you use that to initialize a T2 Metropolis run, etc. So you run a Metropolis algorithm at temperature T2, starting from that lowest E point. You get a bunch of points in S. You let it burn in. You settle down. You find the lowest E point that has arisen from that run. Use that to initialize the Tn+1 run, etc. And after a while, you stop. You don't ever know whether you found the absolute minimum of E or anything like that, Rishi.
Is there like a rate at which a known rate at which this converges?
It depends on lots of things. It depends on the structure of E. And remember, the notion of convergence for this is very weak. I mentioned it. I'm not going to write the condition on the board again. So note that the way this convergence properties are uncertain and they're relatively weak. And actually, properties is a bad word. Let me just use convergence results are relatively weak. And I'll say verbally what those were. Those were that if you let pi n star be the stationary distribution associated with a Metropolis Tn run, that's going to be a Markov chain. It's going to have some unique stationary distribution, blah, blah, blah. Call that pi n star. Then as n goes to infinity, the probability that pi n star assigns to the E minimizing points in S approaches 1. So after a long time with high probability, you'll have a bunch of states or a bunch of S values in your Tn run that are minimizers of E. But how fast that goes depends on how spiky E is and all that kind of, whatever. It depends on your annealing schedule. Okay. Now, people came along and sharpened this up, and that's why I want to wrap up the discussion of simulated annealing by mentioning these Hayek and Satiklis results. And what they did was they sort of massaged the original SA, simulated annealing, by looking at the user choices and altering those and also altering how the algorithm works. Okay? So first of all, what they did was they picked an annealing schedule that approaches 0 very slowly. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. What do I mean by very slowly? Okay? And they also picked the proposal process, which is a part of each of these Metropolis runs, in a way that depended somewhat on the structure of the E function, so that it sort of helped you get away from local minima of E. So what they did was essentially they tooled the quote-unquote proposal process in Metropolis, and implicit in my description of the algorithm over there is the fact that you have some proposal process that you're using in your Metropolis algorithms. And of course you don't have to use that one the same on every run, but people do, and that's what makes it work. So tool the proposal process in Metropolis so as to quote unquote facilitate escape, whatever this means. And you might notice on the course syllabus, I told you that when we talked about simulated annealing, we'd have very few technical details. It's pretty complicated. You can read about it. You know, I could give you the papers, and they're in the references on the website if you want to do that. So as to facilitate escape from local E minima. Okay, those are the two user choices they altered. And how did they alter the way the algorithm runs? So they ran the algorithm in a different way as follows. Okay. Instead of running a whole Metropolis run at temperature Tn and letting it burn in, for each n, what they would do is only do one Metropolis update, one Metropolis step, one proposal, one accept reject. So instead of doing a quote-unquote whole Tn run of Metropolis for each n, instead what they did was do only one Metropolis step. I.e., one update, one proposal / accept reject at temperature Tn. And then they used the result of that Metropolis update to do one Metropolis step at temperature Tn plus 1. So you use the result of that proposal and accept reject to do one Metropolis step at Tn plus 1. And then you use that result to do one Metropolis step at Tn plus 2, and so on. Okay? Now this actually results in the whole algorithm constituting a Markov chain on the state space S. The one difference between the Markov chain arising this way and the ones we've talked about is that it is an inhomogeneous Markov chain. Okay? So what is the result here? The result is that the algorithm, remember, in simulated annealing, what you're doing is you're doing a Metropolis run at a temperature, and then you sort of stop, and then you pick something from there, and you do another Metropolis run. Each of these Metropolis runs is itself a homogeneous Markov chain on the state space that you run for a while. But the whole thing taken together isn't quite a Markov chain. It's a little different. This one, on the other hand, is a Markov chain, but it's an inhomogeneous Markov chain. What does that mean? That is to say, the P of ij for this thing is not time independent. How come? Well, the P of ij results from the proposal / accept reject thing, right? And at time n, you're doing a proposal / accept reject with e to the minus Tn over kt. Whereas at time n plus 7, say, you're doing it with probability e to the minus Tn plus 7, or e to the minus, no, e to the minus e of whatever over ktn, e to the minus e of whatever over ktn plus 7. So you're using different t's at different times, which means that this thing is not time independent anymore. Okay, now we haven't studied these. We haven't studied inhomogeneous Markov chains, but they're around. They exist. People use them all the time. And as it happens, under certain assumptions, they were able to prove a stronger kind of convergence result than Kirkpatrick, Gillette, and Vecchi were able to prove for their original simulated annealing algorithm. And let me describe that briefly. So let's let x sub n be the state at time n of this Markov chain. So in other words, it's the result of the Tn minus 1th Metropolis step. The accept reject thing, the proposal accept reject that happened at Tn plus 1, you turn into that. Okay? Under certain conditions, so Hayek and Tsitsiklis proved that under certain conditions, I'll tell you the kinds of conditions I'm talking about in a second. You have the following, that the probability that x sub n is in S star, and remember S star is the set of E minimizers in the set S, that as n goes to infinity, that equals 1. And in probabilistic terms, for those of you who remember your 3100 or not, if you never took a probability course or whatever, and I don't mean to single you out every time I say that, but I always have to have some target person in the audience to, nudge. Xn converges in probability to a minimizer of E. This is not as strong a result as saying probability that the limit as n goes to infinity of xn is in S star equals 1. This is weaker than that. But it's still stronger than the result that those other guys got. Okay, now what are the certain conditions? What are we talking about here? Essentially, there's three pieces to it, one of which I've referred to already, that they design this queue process, they tool the proposal process so as to facilitate escape from the local minima of E. And in order to do that, what they have to do is they have to make some assumptions about the regularity of E. Okay, so there's sort of like regularity assumptions on the function E, whatever that may mean. And based on these, the tooling of the proposal process has to satisfy certain conditions, namely, in the way they make it somewhat precise what they mean by facilitating escape from local minima of E. And finally, remember, they pick this annealing schedule to approach 0 very slowly. Here's the kind of thing, the kind of condition that entails very slowly. Okay, so meaning of quote unquote Tn goes to 0 very slowly. The condition they came up with was something like this, that the sum from n equals 1 to infinity of e to the minus, I'll tell you what this little d is in a second, over Tn equals infinity, where d is some positive number that depends on the quote-unquote depth of the local minima in E. As it happens, the tooling of the proposal process depends on sort of the width of the bowls that contain the local minima, and this d depends in some amorphous fashion on the depth of the local minima. What's an example of a Tn sequence that would work here? Simple example. Can anybody think of one? Yeah, exactly. Make the nth term 1 over n. Then you have a harmonic series, and everybody knows that diverges. Right? Yeah, even Max knows that diverges. So, for example, T, n, what's that? Tn equals d over natural log of n. Works. Because that makes the nth term equal to 1 over n. And everybody knows, again, this is one of those everybody knows things, that 1 over log n is a relatively slow rate of convergence to 0. Right. Rishi?
Isn't that XKCD about like everyone knows why?
No, I haven't. Send it to me, please. For those of you listening at home, he's talking about XKCD. So that makes him cool, right? All right, so like I said, no technical details. I'm just trying to give you a flavor for what they did. And let me just see if there's anything else I want to mention about this. Okay. You can read about it some more. You can take an AI course where they use it and don't tell you much about it, whatever. Anyway. Okay, now, strictly speaking, well, first of all, is there anything anybody wants to ask about Metropolis and simulated annealing before we move on to the next little course segment? Which I will try to connect with a graceful segue, but will doubtless fail. Yes?
Is the intuition that we're always like in a lattice? That's sort of
Yes, there's a neighborhood structure on S of some kind. His question was, is the intuition that S is always sort of structured like a lattice? The answer is yes, in the sense that you have this notion of who is nearby to who else in S. Like the guys who did simulated annealing, remember what they were trying to do is optimize microprocessor chip layout. So what would be a nearby configuration? Well, if you just move this resistor to here, or you change the value from 47K to whatever the nearest one is. Why is 47K a resistor number? I always thought it was kind of cool because it's a prime number, but you know, whatever. Those are examples of the neighborhood structure you would see on that. And of course, doing the standard old-fashioned Metropolis, the S set is a fixed discretization of phase space, and you have a natural notion of neighbors there. Things whose positions are close, things whose velocity are close, those are neighbors, and so on. So yeah. Any other? Yeah, Mohammed.
This is an example of an annealing schedule.
The sequence of TNs you choose when you run simulated annealing, either in the traditional sense or in the Hayek-Tsatsoulis sense, is called an annealing schedule. And last time I went over why they called it that. In terms of like if someone came up to you in a whole plaza with, remember the blob? Were you here? Yeah, you were here. Yes.
Why is it that this is much more strongly converging one rather than the regular Metropolis algorithm?
Or the regular simulated annealing, you mean?
Sorry.
Yeah, it's just because the math works out that way, and those guys happen to be Hayek and Tsatsoulis, really awesome mathematicians, and they thought of it.
Well, because like, I mean, for me, the way I'm seeing is like you're only choosing one data
Yep.
out of many, right?
Yep.
What if you chose not the best one?
Well, the whole point of simulated annealing, the whole point of Metropolis is that when you move ahead, you're not necessarily choosing the best one. Sometimes you're choosing one that's worse, but that enables you to get to other points in this lattice that may have even better than what you've got so far. Okay?
So that's using the same logic here.
Yes, exactly. But proving this kind of a convergence result is tough. It's not, it's beyond our scope in this class. Yep.
We get the set S star, right? The set S star consists of only the function E minimizers.
Yeah.
This is essentially a subset of the entire state space.
Yep.
But what does the state S star signify? Like they are a set of points?
If you think of S, for example, as being the set of all possible configurations for your chip, right? S star is the set of configurations that minimize whatever criterion E you've chosen to rate the chips. And remember, E is something that takes into account signal propagation delays, congestion. Those are things you have to trade off against each other when you're designing a chip, among other things. So the E minimizing configurations are the ones where you've achieved a perfect balance, at least according to your E function that you've chosen, between signal propagation delays and congestion, right?
So then every element of S star, that is all the xn's, do they give a unique E function, or they give near the range of the E minimizers?
The S star here is defined to be the ones that actually minimize E over S. And of course, you have to assume that there are such things. E might have things that have arbitrarily low, but there's no minimizing. But you know, that's an example of a regularity assumption on E, that there are actually things that minimize E. E could have an inf, but not a min, so to speak.
All are the global minima kind of thing. Right?
Sorry?
Sorry, all are like local minima, right?
Well, no, these are global minima of E. Like, for example, I'll go over into the, you know, Japan, Korea region here. Okay. Suppose E, and I'm drawing it as a continuous graph, even though it's a function on a discrete set in this case. Suppose E looked like this. On S. Okay? These are local minima. These are all local minima that I've drawn here. But these are the only two global minima in this part of the picture. So S star is these 2 points. Only. These are things you want to escape from. The Q process has to be designed so that you can at least get sort of up the walls. And the Tn has to be designed so that, depending on how deep the local minima are, that happens. Okay. Does that help your... Any other questions about this?
So how do different annealing schedules affect our final outcome? That we might get stuck in a local minima or something like that? Or
Yeah, think about the Metropolis. That when you have a spiky E, right? I'm going to give part of the lecture from last time over again if I answer that question in full. The spikes in the e to the minus kt, the Boltzmann distribution, are much higher around the minima of E when t is very small. Okay? So one might, for example, say, well, wait, those peaks stand out really well when t is very small, so why don't we just run Metropolis at a very small t? And the answer is no, because that's kind of like flash freezing a melted crystalline metal. You're not going to get the crystalline structure. So you want to cool it down slowly. And the T's, what they do is they determine how big a step do you take in the Metropolis algorithm. You know, you'll never find those spikes because if T is very small, you'll never accept a low thing with any non-trivial probability, right? I don't know how more explicit I can get than that, but yeah, I mean, you know, this is, I think you could probably, I haven't ever read a Wikipedia article on simulated annealing, so I don't really know how the sort of popularized online resources are, but you know, you could probably find out some good stuff there if you wanted to probe further. It's not that good? You tried? Last semester. Was that AI? Oh, right. Yeah, you were the AI, right? Yeah. Not that you're AI. You know what I mean, right? Not an android. I don't know that for sure. That's true. Hey. Matt could be an android. Anything else? These are all good questions. Why? Does that trigger a private joke memory, or does Humor Us ever do a skit when Matt is an android?
No, that's a good idea.
That's a good idea. Okay. I think it's funnier when people come up and say, you know, I have this sample sequence. What is the signal it came from? You know that.
I hate that.
You hate that?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. All right. Okay, all good questions. All right, so let's move on. Let's move on to the next sort of big topic. And that's this idea of genetic algorithms. And also I'm going to give some very sort of scant lip service to other kinds of evolutionary algorithms, and this is one of those expendables that I'm dropping in the interest of time because I really do want to get to the game theory stuff AQAP. All right, so anyway, just as a sort of a segue here, strictly speaking, Metropolis and simulated annealing are not evolutionary at all, really. Okay, so strictly speaking, Metropolis and SA aren't quote-unquote evolutionary at all. And when I mean that, what I mean by evolutionary, that is to say they don't look at all like, say, biological evolution or anything like that. You're not really evolving populations of points. Like in Metropolis, you're just building a population of points. And SA is a little bit evolutionary because at the end of each of these TN Metropolis runs, you essentially, everybody except one guy goes extinct, and then the next guy spawns a whole new generation, a whole new Cambrian explosion of solutions to your problem, whatever. SA, so let me just say that in Metropolis, you just build one population of points, essentially, and nobody dies, nobody goes away, etc. Okay, so in simulated annealing is, I would say, just in a very kind of shady way, kinda evolutionary. And the idea there is that at the end of a TN run, everybody but one point in S, quote unquote, goes extinct. But to be fair, they might be reborn in a later TN run. So possibly to be, quote unquote, reborn, rediscovered as you go along. But anyway, they aren't really evolutionary per se. There's no genetic business going on. There's no selection or anything like that. Okay, but I wanted to talk to you about them before we talk about genetic algorithms because to me, they fit very nicely into the thread, the intellectual thread, the history leading up to this. So I want to emphasize that. So however, they're clearly Metropolis is an ancestor of all the evolutionary algorithms, because essentially all the evolutionary algorithms are things that move around in some big set in a random fashion, and that's what Metropolis does. Okay.
Did Metropolis evolve into an evolutionary algorithm?
In my mind, it did, yeah. But the question was, did Metropolis evolve into this is homework 2, this is homework 3, by the way, for those of you who are thinking of handing in homework today. Yeah, kind of did. But anyway, all right. So anyway, when was the paper, the Metropolis paper that I held up and showed you? When did it come out? It came out in 1953. Where's my good eraser? Here it is. So the original Metro paper, I should say Metro et al. Paper, remember there's 5 authors, including 2 wives, came out in 1953. One could also say 5 authors, including 2 husbands, by the way. What else happened in 1953? What other huge scientific breakthrough occurred? DNA. Who said it? Thank you. Watson and Crick. So same year, Watson and Crick discovered the molecular structure of DNA. Okay, now really, even before Watson and Crick, all the way back to Mendel, the monk, people had kind of known in some sense that genetic inheritance was digital, right? Like when you put, Mendel had these pea plants with various colored flowers. If you put a yellow and a red together, the offspring don't have orange flowers. They have either red or yellow with given probabilities. That means that in some sense inheritance of the color of flower trait is digital. So people knew that, but discovering this molecular structure put sort of chemical flesh on the idea that genetic inheritance is digital in nature. Okay? So what do we got going on here? We've got this, in biology, you've got this digital mechanism of genetic inheritance that clearly has some randomness in it, right? And by the way, there was an interesting Schrödinger, one of the quantum mechanical progenitors, wrote a book called What is Life, which I would strongly recommend to anybody. It's a very thin book, came out in 1947, and he talks about mutations, and he says the reason I'm writing about this essentially is that mutations are all about quantum mechanics. Okay, that the randomness inherent in quantum mechanics manifests in life in the randomness inherent in mutations. And sure enough, that really is true if you think about it. Like if you shoot radiation at a germ cell and it knocks one of the G's into a T, right? I forget. Whatever. Then, no, the purids and the pyrimidines go together. Anyway, that is a quantum mechanical event. It doesn't happen for sure. It happens sometimes with some probability that you could figure out using Schrödinger's equation, whatever. Okay, but now we've got this chemical flesh on the idea of digital genetic inheritance, together with the existence of computers that people are using to solve cool problems using random algorithms. So that got people thinking. Okay, so together with the Metropolis idea, that is to say, use computers, digital computers / random algorithms to solve cool problems. Together with that idea, and also the idea that nature, through biological evolution, has solved a lot of interesting problems over the millennia. So plus the fact so nature through the underlyingly digital. Is underlyingly a word? I think probably not. Well, now it is, right? One cool thing about language is that there are an infinite number of sentences that have never been spoken. Think about it. What's no, that's been spoken many times. The underlyingly digital random process that it is has solved lots of problems over the millennia. And we probably shouldn't even use millennia. We should probably use like whatever the megania or gigania or something like that. How many people say gigabyte versus gigabyte? I've always said gigabyte, right? Well, Bob Berman, who's our senior vice provost for research, who was also my brother's academic advisor in EP when he was an undergrad here, says gigabyte. I always thought it sounded kind of funny, but anyway, over the megania, the gigania of history, has solved lots of problems. Perhaps most interestingly, if you think as I do, it has evolved whatever we think of as intelligence, whatever that is. Okay, so people thought, you know, hey, Metropolis and everybody, they've used computers and these algorithms to solve interesting problems. Nature's done the same thing with evolution in some sense. Maybe we can use and nature has solved some really cool problems. Maybe we can use computers and use Metropolis-type thinking, whatever, to generate artificial intelligence, perhaps. Whatever. Yeah, Max?
I'm wondering if gigabyte is a correct pronunciation.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, remember, were you there when we talked about GIF versus GIF last semester?
Yeah.
Yeah. The originator says that it's GIF. I'd always said GIF. No, here's why. Because the first time I ever heard about it was from Tony Reeves, who's a professor in our department. He's an English guy, and English guys have very convincing ways of, convincing you of stuff. You have to use TGIF, or, SGIF, or whatever. But anyway, so I heard GIF many years ago. I've said GIF, whatever. And then I saw this commercial during the Super Bowl or no, it wasn't the Super Bowl because my brother was in the room. It was Christmas time or something, and we were watching TV, and there was this commercial on. And I said, what did they say about those people? And he said, I think they said they're GIFing out because they were doing repetitive motions, in their driveway or something around some car. And I said, no, it's GIF, So anyway, we looked it up. And most of the people in 3250 last fall thought it was GIF. Rahul?
We're saying that nature has assumedly solved lots of problems, but isn't it also solving problems per se? So evolution is not something that stops, right? Like, can we still say that
Oh, yeah.
continue going on?
Yeah. People will get stupider, but, just as in Metropolis, they might get smarter. They might get stupider before they get smarter, whatever. You know what I mean? Like, see, think of really smart parents who give birth to a really dumb child who gives birth to a really smart kid, right? So one of those skips generations kind of thing. That's an example of a Metropolis update. Because you accepted a dumber child to get to it. Right. Of course, it can work the other way around as well. Yeah. Anyway, enough stalling. Yes, nature is still solving problems. Absolutely. Okay, so got people thinking. Obviously, this sort of line of thinking. So in the 50s, during the 50s and 60s, people started trying to figure out how to kind of imitate biological evolution in some sense to solve problems on computers. And arguably the earliest author/contributor in this area was a guy named Lawrence Fogel. And this is a discussion that I'm going to cut short. I'm just going to mention. So Lawrence Fogel. And to hear about him is good because his progeny, his sons, are like the leaders of one of the sort of sects, S-E-C-T-S, in genetic algorithm evolutionary computation land. Whereas the descendants of Holland are the leaders of another sect that are kind of at war. Still. There's a schism in the genetic algorithms community. But anyway, Lawrence Fogel, so around 1960, he published a book where he introduced something called it EP, or Evolutionary Programming. And what was he doing? His goal, the title of his book was something like The Simulation of Intelligence by Artificial Evolution, something along those lines. His goal was very lofty. He thought, well, if biological evolution has evolved intelligence over these millennia, maybe we can do it in 10 years or so as the computers evolve or grow or whatever. And essentially what evolutionary programming was, what he was doing was he evolved populations of, and I'm hoping you've heard of this, Mealy machines. Have you heard of that? If you took CS 2800, you definitely heard of it. But 2300, good. Okay, yeah. These are finite state machines that have these states. They have an initial state. And what happens is you get an input, and that does two things. It sends you to another state and spits out a 0 or a 1. Okay, that's a Mealy machine. And so what he did was he evolved populations of Mealy machines. And the goal of his evolutionary process was to predict sequences. From history of sequence, predict the next thing that's going to come. So sequence prediction. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of this. You can read about it. But an example of a sequence that he tried to predict was, first of all, he started simple, right? He started with like a periodic sequence, right? And saw if he could evolve a population of Mealy machines that were good at figuring out that the sequence you were putting in was periodic after it went through 5 or 6 cycles, and then insisting on doing that again and again after that, that was an easy problem to solve. The next one he tried to solve was try to predict whether the next integer is going to be prime as you go up through the integers. And the idea there was, you're supposed to be looking for patterns that detect divisibility by 2 or divisibility by 3, and throwing those out. And he evolved machines that were pretty good at figuring out divisibility by 2 and 3. There's all kinds of stats on these things. But anyway, that was the original. That was the first, as far as I know, the first thing where people were actually looking at populations and doing selection and mutation. So he mutated the machines by, for example, adding states or subtracting states. Changing destinations of transition arrows in the Mealy machine diagram, etc. Okay, so that's the kind of mutation he was doing, and there wasn't any crossover or anything like that. So there's no crossover type stuff going on. You could imagine maybe you could take a Mealy machine and take another one and just tack on the other one where a state of the first one is, and that could be like crossover or whatever. But there was nothing like that in what he did. Okay, so and he did selection based on how good they were at predicting the next thing. So it's selection based on how good the machines were at the prediction task. And he also, in this book, he waxed somewhat philosophical about what is intelligence. Intelligence is the ability to predict what's going to happen next based on your past experience. That was his sort of like capsule summary of what it meant to be intelligent. And so he said, well, let's look at the most elementary kind of prediction task we can think of. You have a sequence of numbers. You get to look at them for a long time, figure out what the next one is. Okay, so that was the first thing. And then another thread was in Germany. And this was independent of Vogel. So contemporaneously and independently in Germany, there were a bunch of guys, and I'll just give you a few of the names, and I'll pronounce them. Well, I won't pronounce them super German, but Rechenburg, is one name. Schwefel, Hofmeister, and Beck. those aren't the only ones, but they were the main folks who developed this thing called evolution strategies. So we have EP coming from Fogel, and we have ES, evolution strategies, coming from those guys. Now, what was this? What was this? This was the goal was not lofty, like evolve intelligence. It was nothing along the lines of what Fogel was trying to do. All they were trying to do was function optimization. So the modest goal was function optimization. And the particular application that most of this stuff got used in, and it still gets used in Germany, I think, is in aircraft design. And speaking of aircraft design, I'm going to have to figure out what my next car is going to be, because Saab is out of business, and I'm, Kyle, I'm a Saab person, right? Because his family has one, and they're great cars, but they're not making them anymore. So I'm gonna have to figure out what to get. And I know that there's a lot of people in the world who favor Japanese cars, but something in me says German cars are the best. What do you think? A Tesla? And have a fire on the highway? No, I'm just kidding. I know. All right. So anyway, the modest goal function. Now, the reason I thought of it was that A, German cars are good, and B, Saabs come from. Did you know Saab is an acronym? SAAB. Svenska Aeroplan Aktiebolaget. The Swedish airplane company. Okay. So the modest goal is function optimization, and essentially what they did was they had these little vectors of numbers, and they had a population of them, and the mutation, there was no crossover until very late in the game, but the mutation was they would perturb each entry with a Gaussian random variable and generate some candidates for the next generation, pick the best n of them, go do that again. And so essentially it was just parallel, doing a bunch of hill climbing in parallel. So hill climbing optimization, quote unquote, in parallel. Okay, no details there. I just want to mention that that was there. And here's, I do have a paper that's easy to read if anyone wants it. It's called A Survey of Evolution Strategies by Beck, Hofmeister, and Schwefel. So this is not an A umlaut, that's an E. Okay, so anyway, pronounced the same, but. All right, now the big one, the one that caught everybody's imagination was Holland. John Holland. So meanwhile, John Holland, and he's a CS professor at University of Michigan. What's that? Michigan what? I heard somebody say something. What, you? No? I heard the word Michigan. All right. CS at Michigan, so during the 60s, came up with this idea of genetic algorithms. And that's what I want to spend most of the time talking about. And there's other things that came after this. So let's take the 3-minute break, and then I want to then move on and talking about this. What's that? The new one? I'm having to learn. Okay. So anyway, genetic algorithms. And I'm not going to talk about all the different kinds. Our focus is going to be on this kind of the standard format of this. And through this discussion, I want to I'm going to talk about the schema theorem and all that kind of thing. And I'm going to try to explain how the early wishful thinking hopes got dashed, and how the two sects in the genetic algorithms community argue and what they argue about, all that sort of thing. So it's going to be a little different from what you see in the book. Some of it's going to be very similar at the beginning. So let's talk about the setup. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the standard setup. with some minor variations. And all those variations are really going to have to do with the selection methods you use. And standard genetic algorithm is what people use. That SGA is what they use for. That also was my high school, the Student Government Association, like the campus politicos were. Was that same in your high school?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so here's the setup. Okay, you're evolving populations of fixed size n. Now, there's no reason why you should confine your attention necessarily to genetic algorithms whose population sizes are fixed. You might even want to let the population die out or let the population grow or something like that. And people play around with these things all the time. But the standard genetic algorithm, you're evolving populations of fixed size n. So you have like population P of t plus 1, etc. are the populations at time t plus 1. What are the individuals in these populations? Okay. The individuals in the populations are bit strings of fixed length and I forget whether, do I want to call it capital L or little l? I'll call it capital L. A fixed length L, same for all. And once again, there's no reason why not to have a genetic algorithm with a variable length bit strings in the population. And in fact, I've played around with those a little bit. Part of the inspiration for that is if you know anything about information theory and coding, then you know that what you can do with variable length codes in terms of getting minimum expected length code, whatever, for noisy channels and things like that. You can do more with variable length codes than fixed length codes. So maybe you can do more in genetic algorithms with variable length populations. I don't know. I think you probably can. Okay, now what are the meanings of the bit strings? So the background, in the background, what have you got? In the background, you have a problem you want to solve. Okay? And you have a set phi of candidate problem solutions. Okay? Now I've chosen the letter phi for a reason. And you'll see, I'm going to see if you can guess what the reason is in a second. Okay. You have this set phi of problem solutions along with a function f from phi to the reals. And I'm going to assume that f is always positive so f takes on only strictly positive values. And this f is supposed to measure the efficacy of the problem solutions. That is to say, f of phi1 bigger than f of phi2. That's true if and only if phi1 is a better solution than phi2. Okay. In the background, you have that, and you also have a surjective mapping G from And I could call it a letter. Well, I'll give it a letter. I'll give it G, capital G onto phi, where G is equal to the set 0, 1 to the nth, and that's Cartesian product notation. In some sense, is the set of all, or to the L, I should say, the set of all binary strings of length L. Okay, so what's the idea here? The idea here is that you encode the candidate problem solutions with bit strings by means of this mapping little g. And in the setup that I'm giving you, it's possible for one problem solution to get encoded by two different bit strings. There's no forbiddance or whatever, no prohibition of that. However, every bit string means something. Okay, so it's possible that one problem solution, say phi and capital Phi, gets encoded by more than one string. Well, whatever. Every string means something. That is to say, encodes some phi. And all phis get encoded. That's the surjectivity. All right, now why did I choose G for the set of bit strings and phi for the set of problem solutions? Cameron? Genotype and phenotype. Very good. Excellent. Okay, so that's the idea. That's the background here. And the populations of bit strings are going to be these genetic representations of possible problem solutions. Okay, so the bit strings in the population are genetic representations, genetic encodings. That is to say, via G of the problem solutions. And I'm going to abuse notation slightly. And really, actually, this is a complaint I have about standard math talk. Okay? I think it should be misuse notation rather than abuse, because abuse notation is like doing wrong to the notation, like hurting it or torturing it or trafficking it or something, whereas misusing notation is like making an erroneous, a kind of a bad use of notation. But everyone says abuse, so I'm going to say abuse slightly. Yeah, I'm pretty OCD about my notation, believe me. There's no argument about that. If you send me a correction of a comma or a double period in the end of a sentence or something, I'll go and do it right away. What's that? Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to abuse notation slightly by writing f of x instead of f of g of phi when g of phi equals x, or g of x equals phi. G of x. Well, you get what I mean. I'm just going to write for every bit string x. I'm going to call f of x instead of f of g of x, which is technically what it is. It's f is a mapping of problem solutions to numbers, but I'm saying f is a mapping of strings to numbers, and I'm just writing it that way. And I'm going to call this fitness of the string X. Okay, so now we're sort of like set up to do what Mitchell's book describes. How did the algorithm, given this edifice, we're going to evolve populations of fixed size n. Individual in the population are bit strings of length L. Each of these bit strings encodes a solution to some problem. The set of all possible solutions to the problem I'm going to call phi. Two different strings can encode the same solution, whatever. And this function f describes how good a solution to the problem it is, and I'm just going to port that over to the axis. All right, so how do we evolve the populations? How do the populations evolve? Say you're at time t. Given p of t, first thing you do is, and I'm also going to assume n is even throughout all this. Given p of t, what I want to do is describe how you get p of t plus 1. First thing you do is you select n strings from p of t. Select n individuals from p of t. And that, how we do that selection, I'm going to save up for a little bit. So step 1 is select n individuals from p of t somehow. More later on this, on the various ways to do that. There's going to be fitness proportional selection, Boltzmann selection, tournament selection, elitist selection of various kinds. These are going to be the parents. And I'm going to refer to them that of the individuals in p of t plus 1. Once you've selected n individuals, pair them up somehow. Doesn't matter how you do that. So pair these individuals up somehow. So now you have n over 2 pairs. Okay, so you've paired them up using whatever South Asian Indian arranged marriage scheme you wanted to use. I don't know. They work out really well sometimes. My friend Bijoy had, like, I remember he was my co-grad student, went back to India and to get married to someone he had met when they were children, but he hadn't seen her in many years, like since they were like kids. And my advisor and I were like, wow, how can they do that, whatever. And then they came back, and she was this absolutely wonderful person. She's so cool, she's charming, she's beautiful, she's all these things, and they're still together, and they have 3 kids. One of them was thinking of coming to Cornell, and I'm thinking, wow, that's really cool that this arranged marriage worked out. But anyway, we do that with these strings. we do that with these strings. We pair them up somehow. Okay, so from each pair, you generate from each pair 2 offspring as follows. Step 1 is you take the 2 strings and you flip a coin and decide whether to cross them over. What does crossover mean? So with probability PC, you cross the strings over. Okay. Somehow. Now, when I say somehow, there's various ways of crossing strings over. There's 1-point crossover at a uniformly selected location. There's 2-point crossover. There's uniform crossover. So various kinds of crossover that you've read about, right? and I'm hoping you understand, 1 point at a uniformly, randomly selected location. And how many locations are there? And if you have a string of length L, you've got L minus 1 possible locations. Or 2 point at 2 uniformly randomly selected locations. And if you get the same location in your 2 selections, you just cross them over at that 1 point, whatever. Uniform, for each bit you flip a coin and decide whether to swap the bit or not swap the bit, etc. Okay. So you don't necessarily cross the strings over. You only do that with a certain probability PC. Having done A, so if the PC coin comes up tails, you don't cross them over. You just keep them the way they are. And then B, take the 2 strings you get from A and independently you look at every single bit on both of those strings, you flip a coin, with probability P sub m. That is to say, flip a quote-unquote mutate or not coin for every bit, one after another. And once you've done that, part C is you take those 2 strings you've generated from that pair and you throw them into P of t plus 1. And you do that for each pair. And since you have n over 2 pairs, each of which generates 2 offspring, you have a population of size n at times t plus 1. So you throw the strings from B into P of t plus 1. And it occurs to me I should really be using script P's here, but whatever. I'm not going to worry about that. OK, so that's how it works. Now, what's left to describe is how you select the parents. And that's what we'll get to next time. Max?
Do they each have 2 offspring?
At n. N. Yeah, the strings are length L, the population size n. Yep. From each pair, you generate 2 offspring. Yeah. Mohammed?
How do you decide the crossover point? Is it like a randomly, let's say it's 1 point?
The classic way to do it is flip the crossover coin. If it comes up yes, I'm going to cross them over. Then you pick out of the L minus 1 possible points to cross them over, uniformly at random, a place to cross them over. That's the classic way to do it. Andrew?
1 point, 2 point versus uniform? What's uniform meaning?
Uniform means you take the strings and you say, OK, am I going to swap bit 1 with bit 1 on the 2 strings?
Bit by bit.
Yeah, bit by bit, yeah. Matt?
Do you flip the crossover coin once or twice?
Once.
Okay.
The crossover coin is a will I or will I not cross them over?
Well, you have two offspring. So each offspring is independently crossed over.
No. You have 2 strings,
Right.
and if the crossover coin comes up yes, you cross them over to generate
So
2 strings. Yeah.
So I take like the first half of one, the first half
Yeah.
of the other, and then the other first half of one, the other first half of one.
Yeah. Say. Suppose the crossover coin comes up yes, and then my spot picking coin comes up here. Then the 2 offspring are going to be 1, 1, 0, 0, and 1, 0, 1, 1.
Gotcha.
So we have twins.